Hi, I'm Dom Eggert, and I'm a teacher and writer for Kaplan. Today, I'm excited to take you through Lesson 7.1, concerning logic and the structure of arguments. Today's lesson will help you more effectively navigate MCAT passages and yield you more points on many of the questions that you encounter. So let's examine the learning goals for this lesson. Our first goal will be to enable you to identify concepts, the basic building blocks of logic, the key ideas that an author uses in a passage. We'll also explore how these concepts relate to one another in various ways, and how these concepts build what we call claims, statements that the author makes. Second, we'll show you how to recognize the components of an argument, that is, the different claims that serve as evidence, conclusion, inferences, and refutations. For our first learning goal, we're going to investigate different concepts in passages, how those concepts relate to one another, and how they work together to build claims. In order to do this, we'll go line by line, extensively investigating one particular passage, and we'll see how you should approach critical reading on test day. So here's our first example passage. As we go through the text together, pay attention to the prompts on the right-hand side of the page. These prompts are designed to help you home in on the most important aspects of each paragraph, what Carr's questions are most likely to ask you about. So the passage begins, "The social novel has always presupposed a substantial amount of social stability." So, what is the defining characteristic of the author's concept of the social novel? It should be clear that social stability is the defining characteristic here. The phrase always presupposed points out that there's this connection between these two concepts, the social novel and stability of society. Now, as we continue, look out for an example that's given of this social novel. The ideal social novel had been written by Jane Austen, a great artist who enjoyed the luxury of being able to take society for granted. It was there and seemed steady beneath her glass, Napoleon or no Napoleon. So, what example of the social novel is given? It's the novels of Jane Austen. And language such as great artist indicates that not only does Jane Austen give us an example of a social novelist, this is one that the author is rather fond of. Now, we have one more question to be addressed as we look through the remaining part of the paragraph here. We're going to see something new. So returning to the text, "But soon it would not be steady beneath anyone's glass." And the novelist's attention had necessarily to shift from the gradations within society to the fate of society itself. It is at this point that the political novel comes to be written, the kind in which the idea of society, as distinct from the mere unquestioned workings of society, has penetrated the consciousness of the characters in all of its profoundly problematic aspects. What new concept is introduced, and how does it relate to the social novel? Well, it should be clear, our new concept is the political novel. It comes after the social novel at a point when we start to see society no longer being unquestioned, but the characters are actually starting to wonder about society at large. So we see in this first paragraph, the author is creating a contrast between two concepts: the social novel, which depends on social stability, and the political novel, in which society is called into question. As we move on now to the second paragraph, we want to look out for the answer to the next prompt. This concept that's just been introduced to us, the political novel, has a particular defining characteristic. So the text reads, "The political novel," I have in mind its ideal form, "is peculiarly a work of internal tensions." So the defining characteristic of the author's concept of the political novel is something like conflict or tension. Now, any tension is going to have at least two sides to it. So the author's going to introduce two distinct concepts that give us the different sides of this conflict. We want to watch out for these concepts and the different terminology that the author uses to refer to each side. So as I read the text, look out for these different terms. To be a novel at all, it must contain the usual representation of human behavior and feeling. Yet, it must also absorb into its stream of movement the hard and perhaps insoluble pellets of modern ideology. So our basic contrast we see is between behavior and feeling on the one hand and ideology on the other. Now the author is going to use some other terms to refer to each side, and we want to watch out for these. The conflict is inescapable. The novel tries to confront experience in its immediacy and closeness, while ideology is by its nature general and inclusive. Yet it is precisely from this conflict that the political novel gains its interest and takes on the aura of high drama. The timelessness of abstraction is confronted with the flux of life. The monolith of program with the diversity of motive. The purity of ideal with the contamination of action. So the author switched up the order in the very last sentence, putting the ideology aspect first and the behavior and feeling aspect second, but we still have this general parallel structure. So the one side of the conflict has to do with human behavior, feeling, experience, immediacy, and so forth. And the other side of the conflict has to do with ideology, that timelessness of abstraction, the monolith of program, the purity of ideal. What the author is doing here is reflected in our Kaplan tip. The author is using parallel structure, repetition in the phrasing of that last sentence. The similarity in the different clauses, which serve to create a particularly stark contrast between two concepts. In this case, between experience, behavior, feeling on the one hand, and ideology or ideas on the other hand. We call this a dualism or a dichotomy. All of those different words are really just repeating the same two basic ideas in contrast to one another. Now let's move on to the third paragraph. Again, I'll read the text. Because it exposes the impersonal claims of ideology to the pressures of private emotion, the political novel must always be in a state of internal warfare, always on the verge of becoming something other than itself. Take a moment now to answer the prompt, what new information is introduced in the first sentence of this paragraph? Well, what we find once again is more new terms that are expressing the same basic idea. So there's no new information. Internal warfare, becoming something other than itself, this is just another way of talking about the conflict in the novel. So a lot of authors in the cars section will write in ways like this. There's no new information here, so don't spend too much time on this sentence. Continuing, we go back to the text. The political novelist establishes a complex system of intellectual movements, in which his own opinion is one of the most active, yet not entirely dominating, movers. Are we not close here to one of the secrets of the novel in general? I mean the vast respect that the great novelist is ready to offer the whole idea of opposition, the opposition he needs to allow for in his book, against his own predispositions and yearnings and fantasies. So now, take a moment to answer the second prompt. What claim does the author make about the political novelist's opinion? The key to answering this is noting that the author says the political novelist has his own opinion be just one of the most active, yet not entirely dominating movers. In other words, we're going to find multiple opinions in a political novel. So the author's opinion is but one of several. So given all this text, again, we're not finding too much in the way of new ideas. Just one paragraph remaining now. As we read this final paragraph, watch out for the first sentence, which contains a double negative, and see if you can figure out a way of rephrasing the sentence more simply. The text reads, "This is not to say that the political novelist desires, both acknowledged and repressed, fail to play a pivotal role in the novel's dialectic. If we remove the not and the fail, we have the statement that the political novelist desires do in fact play a pivotal role in the novel's dialectic." As we move on to the next sentence, watch out for what we find after the colon. The sentence is quite a doozy, and you want to try to identify what we really are looking at here. "Indeed, the political novel turns characteristically to an apolitical temptation. In The Possessed, to the notion that redemption is possible only to sinners who have suffered greatly. In Conrad's Nostromo and Under Western Eyes, to the resources of private affection and gentleness. In Man's Fate, to the metaphysical allurements of heroism as they reveal themselves in a martyr's death. In Cylon's Bread and Wine, to the discovery of peasant simplicity as a foil to urban corruption. And in Darkness at Noon, to the abandoned uses of the personal will." What are all of these items following the colon? They're just examples of political novels and a taste of the kind of conflicts that they contain. So, to the final sentence, this, so to say, is the pastoral element that is indispensable to the political novel, indispensable for providing it with polarity and tension. What is the author doing in the final sentence? Well, not all that much that's new. Essentially just summarizing what's happened already and reiterating this idea that's been repeated again and again that political novels are characterized by tension. Now that we've dealt with concepts and claims, let's move on to the second learning goal of Lesson 7.1, which shows how claims work together to build what we call arguments. We'll be looking at a number of examples to make clear what the different parts of an argument are, and then we'll put all of that together by looking at a final passage that's heavily dependent on different arguments within it. In its most basic form, an argument consists of two parts, both of which are constituted by claims. On the one hand, you'll have a conclusion. That's a claim which is supported. On the other hand, there's evidence. Evidence is going to be at least one claim, possibly more, which actually does the supporting of the conclusion. So evidence supports a conclusion. Now let's look at some examples. We'll look at series of claims that could be something like you see in an actual MCAT passage, and we'll see how we can pick out the arguments within them, noting what's conclusion and what's evidence. In our first example, we have all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. The word therefore is a conclusion keyword. It tells us that the conclusion of this argument is that Socrates is mortal. So the evidence is everything that comes before that all men are mortal, and that Socrates is himself a man. So this is an argument that absolutely must work out. If it's true that all men belong into this larger category of beings which are mortal, and if it's true that Socrates is in that category of being a man, then it must be true that Socrates also falls within that larger category of mortals. Our next example is a little bit different. Take a look at this one and figure out what is the conclusion and what is the evidence. For this case, the key word that helps us differentiate is after all. Now, even though it has this sense of coming at the end, that's not what we mean by a conclusion in an argument. Remember again, a conclusion is just a supported claim. In this case, it's the claim that politician is lying, which is being supported by the other claim, his lips are moving. So that brings us to our Kaplan tip. These types of words, known as logic keywords, will give us a clearer sense of what constitutes support and what constitutes a supported claim, a conclusion. Of course, arguments are a bit more complex than the simple evidence and conclusion form would suggest. Many MCAT questions will ask about the implicit parts of arguments, what we call inferences. Inferences come in two types. On the one hand, there are assumptions. These are unstated pieces of evidence. They're claims which must be true in order for the conclusion of an argument to follow. On the other hand, there are implications. Implications are just unstated conclusions. They're claims which follow from the other claims that make up the argument. So let's look for some example inferences in this next exercise. The argument is that it's dangerous to drive on Main Street because Main Street is icy. That tells us that the conclusion it's dangerous to drive on Main Street is due to the evidence that Main Street is icy. So something must be connecting this danger in driving to the iciness of Main Street. This will be our assumptions. Take a moment to think about what is the key assumption that lets Main Street is icy be evidence that it's dangerous to drive on Main Street. It may seem obvious, but it's dangerous to drive on icy streets must be true in order for this conclusion to follow. That's what allows the iciness of Main Street to connect to the danger of driving on it. Now take a moment to think about what are some claims that must be true given what this argument states. And there are a lot of possibilities here. So just think of one example. A few options would be that I will be in danger if I drive on Main Street. This would have to be true if it is correct that it's dangerous to drive on Main Street. That danger would also apply to me. Secondly, we can also infer from this that other streets are safer for driving. In other words, streets that aren't so icy would be better routes to take. Finally, you could see something like Main Street is cold. In order for it to be icy out at all, it must also be true that Main Street is cold. Our Kaplan tip reminds us that inferences are precisely based on this idea of something which must be true. It's not enough that it just might be the case, but it must be true given the truth of the other claims that are made. That's going to be generally true of all inferences. Now that we've looked at conclusions, evidence, and different kinds of inferences, there's one component left to consider, and that's what we call refutations or objections. These are claims that serve to challenge the conclusion of an argument. If they are true, they make the conclusion less likely to be true, the opposite of what evidence does. Now, a refutation might have its own supporting evidence that helps to build it up, in which case we call it a counter-argument. Consider the following example. You can reach happiness by satisfying your desires. Thus, you should only desire what you already have. The conclusion keyword thus tells us that you should only desire what you already have is the conclusion of our argument. The evidence is thus the claim that came before it. One way to challenge an argument is by challenging its evidence, or challenging its conclusion, or challenging an assumption in the argument. Any of these will potentially work. So take a moment now to think about a way of refuting this argument. One possibility would be to deny an assumption. In this case, it is not possible to desire only that which you already have. Now, it might not seem obvious, as some assumptions have seemed before, but generally when we say that you should do something, the suggestion is that it's possible for you to do that thing. For example, if I were to say, you should flap your arms like wings and fly around the room, I'd be assuming that it's possible for you to do that. If it's not possible, it would be a strange thing to say that you should do this. Now that we've examined the different parts that constitute arguments, the different kinds of claims that you can see, from evidence and conclusions, to implications and assumptions, to objections or refutations, let's actually work on identifying these within the context of a car's passage. In this exercise, we'll be mimicking the same reading procedure that you'll be using on test day, that critical reading step, where we'll be looking out for keywords to help us home in on the most important parts of each passage. So as I read the text, look out for why the Articles of Confederation Congress wants a new constitution. Sensing that government defined by the Articles of Confederation did not meet the needs of the newly born United States, the Congress of the Articles of Confederation authorized commissioners to, quote, devise such further provisions as shall appear to them necessary to render the Constitution of the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union. Given that they say that the Articles of Confederation did not meet the needs of the United States, they're in effect saying that the Articles of Confederation weren't working so well. So that was their reason. Now, as I continue with the text, be on the lookout for these next two prompts. We want to look for a conclusion that some members of Congress are reaching about legality, as well as the reasoning behind that conclusion. The text continues, these provisions were to be reported to Congress and confirmed by every state. The recommendatory acts also state that this change, to be done through alterations of the Articles of Confederation, is the most probable means of establishing a strong national government. Having given these instructions, Congress was quite surprised by the radically new terms of the Constitution submitted. In fact, some congressmen claim that the commissioners did not have the legal authority to submit such a revolutionary document. So take a moment to answer those prompts. Well, in the first case, we see this language. Some congressmen claimed. What are they claiming? That the commissioners lacked the legal authority. They did not have it. So the conclusion is basically that it was illegal. And the reasoning was because it was so revolutionary. It had these radically new terms. So it was simply too revolutionary for what they were asking for. We continue now with the second paragraph. The text reads, in the Federalist Papers, James Madison defends the commissioners by returning to the terms of their mandate. Given the goals expressed in the recommendatory acts, and the principle that conflicts ought to be resolved in favor of more important goals, Madison argued that the degree to which the Constitution departs from the Articles couldn't make the Constitution illegal. So, what conclusion does James Madison reach about the legality of the Constitution? Well, given that he says that it couldn't make the Constitution illegal, we have a double negative, he's effectively saying that it is legal. Let's continue with the text. Where the goal of amending the Articles conflicts with the goal of creating good government, the Articles must yield, since the goal of quote-unquote good government is an overriding consideration. What is Madison's reasoning then? Well, we find that it has to do with the goal of good government. This is overriding. We also see language like, given the goals expressed in those recommendatory acts, as well as the principle that conflicts ought to be resolved in favor of more important goals. We can see that Madison's reasoning is that the important goal here, which is overriding, is that there be a good government. And this goal takes precedence over any other goal, like following the exact orders of the Articles of Confederation Congress. As we move on to the third paragraph now, consider what we've seen so far. We saw Congress making a request about changing the Articles of Confederation and replacing it with a new constitution. We saw how in that first paragraph some congressmen objected to the new constitution because it was too radical. But then in the second paragraph, Madison came back and said that it was okay. This was legal because there was that overriding goal. What we haven't seen yet is the author's actual position. So notice that the prompts on this page have to do specifically with what the author thinks. The third paragraph begins, although Madison argued fairly convincingly that the degree of change present in the Constitution cannot be grounds for declaring it illegal, this same argument does not apply to the Commissioner's decision to allow the Constitution to be ratified by only 3/4 of the states. So as we look at the text here, we see language like Madison argued fairly convincingly. Notice how that's not qualified by other statements, such as some congressmen thought that, or Madison in particular thought that. Who is this convincing to? Well, it's convincing to the author. But there's a contrast. So although that one part of Madison's argument was convincing, notice the author says, again without qualification, this same argument does not apply. Where does it not apply? To the Commissioner's decision to allow 3/4 ratification. So it seems like the author is going to have some issues with the legality of the Constitution. So let's continue with the paragraph. Even though unanimous approval appears last in Madison's list of the goals of the Convention, it was a fundamental aspect of national government under the Articles. Requiring non-ratifying states to be bound by the new Constitution was thus a powerful diminishment of their sovereignty. So answer the last prompt on this page. What is the piece of evidence discussed here? Well, what the author says is that this non-unanimous ratification is going to result in a powerful diminishment of the sovereignty of the states. So the idea here is that the Articles of Confederation allowed every state to have a say. In order to have changes approved, there had to be unanimity among the states. But the commissioners now are only asking for 3/4 approval, and so the states are losing out. So we've already read half the passage, but we've still only gotten just a taste of what the author's opinion is. There's still 3 paragraphs remaining, and each of these paragraphs has an accompanying prompt. Take a few minutes now and read the remaining paragraphs. As you read each paragraph, fill in an answer for the accompanying prompt for that paragraph. When you finish, we'll review. So our first prompt asks about the author's counter-argument against Madison's position on the Constitution's legality. So keep in mind that a counter-argument is just a refutation that has its own evidence. So we see in this paragraph that the states did not intend to waive their veto power. This is the evidence used to support the conclusion that the Constitution should not affect the legal rights of the states. It does not follow that it should affect the legal rights of the several states. So that's our counter-argument. Moving on to the next paragraph, the prompt asks us, what is the author's conclusion about the moral or ethical standing of the Constitution? You'll notice that this paragraph starts off with a question. Does this imply that the Constitution ratified by the states has no moral authority? Then the author answers that not necessarily. So we see that the Constitution has moral authority even if it lacks legal authority. The final prompt asks us about the reasoning behind this conclusion. We see in this next to last paragraph a strong claim, no government ought to have the power to entrench itself against amendment. So this is one statement that the author is making in support of that. In the next paragraph, we see language like, the ethical case for rebelling is further strengthened by some other claims. One is that the government admitted that it was not fit. The Articles of Confederation were not sufficient. We even have some statements here about the position of the framers, how they rebelled against England, presumably which had a bad government, which made defying the Articles of Confederation government a lot easier. So altogether, we see claims like the government should not avoid change if needed in that next to last paragraph, that Congress admitted the Articles of Confederation weren't working, and that rebelling against England set that precedent that the framers were unwilling to follow a bad government. So altogether, this is evidence supporting the author's conclusion that the Constitution has moral legitimacy, even if it lacks legal authority. After critically reading that passage and allowing the prompts to guide us to look for the most important points, those points that MCAT questions are most likely to ask us about, we can now perform the third step in the reading method, and that's labeling the paragraphs. Now, ordinarily on test day, you would want to provide a label after you read each paragraph, but we'll use the answers to those questions to guide us as we label them all right now. The first paragraph, we saw an introduction to the issue and how Congress was asking for a replacement for the Articles of Confederation, but some congressmen thought that the new Constitution that was submitted was a bit too radical. So something along these lines would be a good label for paragraph 1. For the second paragraph, we see James Madison's position. And recall that Madison's position was that this Constitution was in fact legal. And the reasoning was that good government provides that overriding goal. As we got to the third paragraph, we started to see the author's perspective. Not what some congressmen thought, not what Madison thought, but rather what the author, him or herself, thought. In this case, the Constitution is illegal, at least according to the Articles of Confederation, because it had 3/4 ratification instead of unanimous approval. The fourth paragraph provides us more backing for that, support for the counter-argument against Madison, the evidence being that the states never really waived their veto power. However, the author's position becomes a bit more complicated in paragraph 5. Even though the authors just argued that the Constitution lacks legal authority, it does have some moral authority. And one reason that's given in this paragraph is because you can't rule out change. No government should be able to entrench itself against amendment. In the final paragraph, we just got more reasoning to support that conclusion about the morality of the Constitution. We saw that the Articles of Confederation, Congress admitted the flaws of the Articles, and we also saw the framers rebelling against England's bad government before. Now that we have those labels, we want to take a moment for the very last step in the critical reading method, and that's to reflect upon the goal of the passage. What was the author's overall point? Well, it's to make a kind of argument, namely to argue that the Constitution was ethically justified even though it was illegal under the Articles of Confederation. So this is a sample outline like you could make for a passage of this sort on test day. After examining 2 passages and a number of other exercises, we can now recap the major points about concepts, claims, and arguments. As we saw in the first passage that we reviewed, concepts are characterized by meaning or definition. So, for instance, with the social novel, that was defined as being a novel that presupposes social stability. We saw concepts existing in different relationships. For instance, the social novel came before, chronologically, the political novel. We also saw in that first passage a variety of terms being used to refer to the same underlying concepts. So many different terms were employed to refer to the different parts of that conflict. We also saw a number of examples. In the fourth paragraph of the first passage, we saw several examples of political novel and the kinds of conflicts that exist within them. We also saw the author of that passage make several claims about the political novel, saying things like, the author's opinion is just one of several within the novel. In addition, we investigated the different parts of arguments. We looked at conclusions, which are really just the main points of an argument, what the author is trying to convince you of, using other kinds of support. That support, when explicitly referred to, is evidence. When it is not explicitly mentioned, it's known as an assumption. That's a claim which has to be true in order for the conclusion to follow. We also saw implications, which are claims which have to follow from the parts of the argument that are given. Finally, we saw some examples of refutations, such as in the last passage where the author refuted James Madison's opinion that the new Constitution was legal under the Articles of Confederation. Congratulations! You've now completed Lesson 7.1 concerning the structure of arguments. You're now in a much better place to manage Carr's passages more effectively, picking out the important concepts and claims, and the key arguments that authors make. There'll be many questions on test day having to do with argumentation, and now you're in a better position to handle them. Good luck with your future lessons.